I should have known better than to accept an invitation without any clue who sent it. But the card was captivating, beautifully hand-drawn with intricate designs wrapping around my name and an odd symbol that looked vaguely familiar. It appeared on my doorstep just days before Halloween. No postage, no return address. It was unsettling and intriguing all at once. And apparently, I wasn't the only one who got one. That Halloween night, I found myself outside an old mansion on the edge of town, a hulking, abandoned beast of a place that looked ready to collapse in on itself at any second. Dark windows stared blankly back at me, reflecting only the ghostly gleam of the moon. I wasn't the first one there. My friends stood scattered in front of the mansion, each holding an identical invitation, each staring at the house with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Who would throw a party here? I muttered, though it wasn't like I expected an answer. But we had all decided to come, driven by the same gnawing need to understand why we'd been invited, and to whom we'd been invited by. The moment we stepped inside, the door slammed shut with a resounding echo that shook the walls. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust motes floated through our flashlights' beams, and somewhere deeper within the house, floorboards creaked in response to our intrusion. The house was empty. No decorations, no music, no laughter of partygoers. Just silence and shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe with us. In the center of the first room, a sight froze us in place. A circle of masks meticulously laid out on the floor, each one a perfect, eerie replica of each of us. I stared down at mine, its hollow eyes staring back, an almost lifelike quality to the smile etched into its pale, cold features. My stomach twisted. Why did they look so real? One by one, my friends began to disappear. It wasn't sudden, not exactly. First, one of us would linger a bit too long in the darkness, or wander a little too far down one of the unending corridors. Then we'd call out their names, and there'd be no answer. When we retraced our steps, we'd find nothing but silence, and their mask moved from the circle, lying cold and still on the floor. Panic started to sink in as I realized I was alone. I could feel my breath quicken, my heartbeat racing in my chest like a caged animal trying to escape. I could feel the house pressing down on me, closing me in. Every shadow seemed to watch. Every creak felt like a warning. I tried to find a way out, any door, any window, but the more I searched, the more it felt like the house was shifting, changing. Hallways that should have led me back to the entrance wound deeper into darkness. Rooms I hadn't seen before opened up before me, each one colder, emptier than the last. At last, I stumbled back into the main room, breathless and nearly delirious with fear. My mask lay in the center of the circle, staring up at me. The invitation rested beside it. Only now there was something different about it. Scrawled across the front and hurried, uneven letters was a new message. Now you see yourself. A sudden, horrifying clarity washed over me. All those faces on the masks, they weren't just imitations. They were us, somehow captured, mirrored, waiting for something or someone. I was the last one left. My friends had been lured here, one by one, tricked into becoming part of this nightmarish game. With shaking hands, I picked up my mask, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. There, on the back, was my own handwriting. Come alone. The words blurred as my vision darkened, a strange heaviness settling over me. I tried to scream, but there was no sound, only the silence of that empty, endless house, and the sensation of slipping, as if into sleep, or maybe into the mask. I finished my shift at the convenience store later than usual that Halloween night. The fog was thick, swallowing the road in dense, swirling patches that reflected my car's headlights right back at me. The night was quiet, disturbingly so, the usual hum of life and Halloween night trick-or-treaters strangely absent. I convinced myself it was only the fog dampening everything. As I turned onto the winding back road toward home, I noticed headlights behind me, a car trailing at what felt like a perfectly measured distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was used to the lonely drive on this road, and it wasn't unusual to see another car here and there. But this car was different. The headlights flickered, brightening and dimming rhythmically, like a pulse. An uncomfortable sensation crept over me, like an invisible hand pressing between my shoulder blades. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, telling myself to stay focused. But the lights behind me throbbed, their erratic flickering becoming almost hypnotic. Then came a sharp flash, a blinding strobe of light that made my stomach lurch. I squinted into my rearview mirror, straining to see the driver, but the headlights were too bright. All I could make out was the outline of the car, which seemed old, its edges distorted in the fog, as though it were half dissolving into the mist. My pulse quickened. Why hadn't they passed me? I slowed down, hoping they would go around, but the car behind me slowed too, its headlights flaring again, nearly blinding me. A sick feeling churned in my stomach as I realized they were deliberately matching my pace. I sped up, my hands white-knuckling the wheel as I tried to lose them, but every twist and turn I took, they mirrored. My heart thundered against my ribs as I neared a sharper curve, taking it too fast, my tires skidding slightly against the wet asphalt. I glanced back, expecting the other car to finally fall behind. But they kept up, effortlessly, as if the rules of speed and physics didn't apply. Then, in one terrifying instant, the headlights vanished. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling a rush of relief followed quickly by cold dread. Had they veered off the road? Or was this some cruel trick? My pulse thudded in my ears as I continued, craning my neck to catch sight of them again, but the road behind me lay dark and empty. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt watched. That's when the fog parted just enough for me to see something ahead on the road. A figure. No, two figures standing side by side in the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I skidded to a halt a few feet away. A man and a woman stared back at me, unmoving, unblinking. Their faces were pale, hollow, eyes sunken as if they hadn't slept in years. Their clothes were dark and damp, clinging to their frames as though they'd been pulled from some deep, cold water. The woman raised a hand slowly, and it took me a second to realize she was holding something, a long, thin object glistening in the moonlight. A car key. I watched frozen, as the woman lifted the key and dragged it slowly across her throat in one fluid, deliberate motion. The man beside her mirrored her movements exactly, his hand lifting to his own neck, slicing his throat with an invisible key. They held my gaze, their mouths slack and hollow, as thin, dark lines began to streak down their necks. Panic clawed its way up my throat. I couldn't look away, couldn't even breathe as I watched their eyes widen, and then their bodies crumple forward onto the pavement. Gasping, I threw the car into reverse, my foot heavy on the pedal as I sped backward down the road, desperate to put distance between me and those lifeless figures. My rearview mirror showed nothing but fog, swallowing the scene as though it had never existed. But then, just as I began to calm, the flickering headlights reappeared behind me, closer than ever, and I could swear, just for a second, that I saw those hollow eyes staring back at me in my own rearview mirror. The car behind me pulled to a stop, the fog closing in around it. But it didn't turn off its lights. It sat there, the headlights bright and piercing, illuminating the road ahead. I waited, trapped into silence, watching, helpless to do anything but grip the wheel as my mind scrambled for answers. And then, from somewhere in the fog, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving toward my door. Halloween in our neighborhood had always been a safe affair. Families lined the streets, parents laughing as kids darted from house to house, the air filled with echoes of trick-or-treat calls. But this year, things felt wrong. Whispers were already going around about a handful of kids who disappeared earlier that week, each one on their way home from the infamous house at the end of Cypress Avenue, the one that gave out the full-size candy bars. I hadn't thought much of it, brushing off the rumors as Halloween mischief. But then my friend Julia's son vanished. I remembered her frantic call, voice trembling as she explained he'd left with a group of friends to the house on Cypress and had never come back. That night, a small group of us gathered, determined to get answers. Parents from the neighborhood, each one more desperate than the last. marched up the path to the house, our flashlights casting uneasy beams on the overgrown yard and chipped paint of the front porch. The house loomed above us, a silent witness to the fear and anger gnawing at each of us. The door creaked open with barely a touch, revealing a dim, empty hallway stretching into shadows. It was eerily quiet. No sign of life, no hum of electricity, just an overpowering scent of decay that hit us as we stepped inside. My heart pounded. There was something terribly wrong about this house, an almost tangible sense of dread that settled over us like a thick fog. We spread out, each moving from room to room, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional creak of old wood beneath our feet. Dust hung in the air, and the faint scent of something metallic grew stronger as we went deeper into the house. Then we found them, small, innocent candy wrappers scattered along the hallway floor, leading in a haphazard trail toward the basement door. Some of them were crumpled and torn. Others were stained with something dark. A shiver raced down my spine as I bent to pick one up, the paper damp, sticky. It felt wrong, like it hadn't been discarded so much as dropped in a hurry. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I gripped the cold handle of the basement door and pulled it open. The stairway descended into darkness, a stale, suffocating air rising up to meet us. It was silent, an unnatural kind of silence that felt almost alive. We hesitated at the top, sharing a look of dread, but the thought of our missing children pushed us forward. The descent felt endless, each step a betrayal of instinct, the walls pressing closer, the smell of decay thickening. My flashlight's beam cut through the dark, illuminating only bare cement walls and damp, dripping pipes. And then there at the bottom of the stairs we saw it. Rows of makeshift shelves lined the basement walls, each one crowded with tattered, worn-out Halloween costumes, tiny superhero capes, princess tiaras, plastic pirate swords. It was a grotesque collection, each piece soaked in a faint, sticky residue. The air grew colder, sharper, and my skin crawled with the sudden, horrifying realization that these were the costumes of the missing children. We staggered back, struggling to breathe, our eyes darting around the basement, searching, hoping for any sign of life. That's when my flashlight flickered, its beam catching something on the floor, a small shoe, bright orange, lying in the center of the room like a forgotten relic. My stomach churned. It was Julia's son's shoe. Panic surged through me as we began searching frantically, voices growing louder, more desperate. But the room was empty. There were no hidden doors, no closets, no crawl spaces. Just bare cement and silence, mocking our efforts. Then a sound of faint, dragging shuffle coming from above. The basement door creaked shut, and the lock clicked with a cold, deliberate finality. We froze, the small basement swallowed by a sudden, suffocating darkness. My pulse roared in my ears, the weight of the silence pressing in, making it hard to breathe. A faint glow appeared near the top of the stairs, a single flashlight beam, slowly swaying back and forth. And in that narrow, quivering beam, a figure loomed. A tall man, face shrouded in shadow, stood at the top of the stairs, watching us, unmoving. And then he began to hum, a low, almost tuneless melody that twisted around the silence, filling the air with a creeping dread. We were trapped. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. His footsteps echoed as he started down, each one deliberate, heavy, unhurried. I clutched the wall, feeling the cold cement scrape my fingers. But there was no escape. The shadows closed in, my friends' breaths coming in shallow, terrified gasps. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed us was that small, hollow laugh and the sticky touch of candy wrappers clinging to the floor beneath my hands. It started as a joke, just harmless Halloween fun, or so I thought. My friends had dared me to prank old Mrs. Wren, the cranky woman down the street who scowled at anyone passing her house. She lived alone, rarely left, and had the kind of expression that made you wonder if she ever knew how to smile. Perfect target, they said. I threw a few eggs at her front door, smeared shaving cream across her porch, and left a fake spider in her mailbox. Harmless. Petty, really. But the next morning, a photo was waiting for me on my doorstep. A clear picture of me in the act, crouched in her yard with my face twisted into a mischievous grin. My stomach dropped. Who had taken it? And why would they leave it here? An odd sense of dread crept in as I glanced up and down the street, half expecting someone to be watching. But there was nothing. When I found the second photo the next day, I felt my heart pick up speed. This one was taken in the early morning as I was leaving my house. The focus was sharp, capturing the nervous expression on my face as I locked the door, looking over my shoulder. A familiar fear crept into my chest, but I shoved it down, telling myself it was just someone's way of getting back at me. Maybe Mrs. Wren was more clever than she seemed. By the third day, I was truly rattled. Another photo lay on my doorstep, this time showing me sitting in my car at a stoplight, glancing in the rearview mirror. I didn't even remember doing that. My skin crawled at the thought of someone watching me so closely, documenting my every move, following me. I wanted to brush it off, tell myself it was a prank, but as I turned the photo over, a chill ran down my spine. Written on the back in shaky, jagged letters were the words, "I see you." I stopped leaving the house as much, but it didn't matter. Each morning, another photo waited for me, each one a little closer, more invasive. They were always taken in places I thought were private. Brushing my teeth, staring out the kitchen window, lying in bed with the lights off, my eyes wide open in the dark. A creeping dread settled into my bones. How can anyone get these pictures? I checked every door, every window, but found nothing. Whoever was doing this knew my house, my schedule, my life. They knew things about me I didn't even notice myself. And then the worst one arrived. This time, the photo wasn't of me. It showed the interior of my own house, my living room, just as it had looked a few minutes before I'd gone to bed. But there, in the shadows by the window, was a figure. The image was blurry, but the shape was unmistakable. A tall, thin figure standing completely still, its face hidden by the darkness. I felt my blood run cold as I realized that they had been inside my house. I grabbed a flashlight, racing downstairs, heart hammering, barely able to breathe. The room was empty, of course, but the lingering sense of being watched was overpowering. I checked every closet, every corner, feeling the walls close in around me, each shadow taking on a sinister shape. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. Every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind outside felt like a threat, like the thing in the photo was moving closer. In the morning, I found one last picture. It was of me, taken from the foot of my bed, as I slept with the covers pulled up to my chin, my eyes half open in terror. But what caught my attention, what sent my mind spiraling, was the figure at the edge of the bed. They weren't just watching this time. They were sitting beside me, their face tilted toward mine, just inches away, staring down as though studying me. My skin prickled with horror as I saw that their face was mine. And in my own handwriting, scrawled across the bottom of the photo, were 4 words that haunted me for the rest of my life. Now you know me. It had been the talk of the season. The old Ridley Mansion, abandoned for decades, transformed into a Halloween haunted house attraction. Local teens dared each other to go every year, but now it was open to the public, complete with jump scares, elaborate decorations, and the air of decay lingering from years of disuse. My friends and I decided to go, laughing off our nerves as we crossed the threshold into the dark, looming structure. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and age. Fake cobwebs hung in every corner, but it was the house itself that gave it authenticity. The darkened wallpaper, the creaky floors, the smell of something damp and long forgotten. But it wasn't the decor that unsettled us. It was the window on the top floor. Almost as soon as we entered, we heard it, a faint wail, drifting down the stairs from that single, high window. At first, it sounded like part of the setup. Clever effects to set the mood, we thought. But there was something too real about that sound, something that tightened my throat and sent a shiver down my spine. The cries were relentless, growing louder and sharper as we moved through the rooms. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of the window high above, dark and empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from there unseen. In the next room, a staff member in costume jumped out, and we screamed, laughing to shake off our tension. But as we moved on, the wails persisted. Now, they seemed less like sound effects and more like genuine sobs, broken and desperate, echoing through the house. Each cry seemed to scratch at something inside me, a fear I couldn't name. We finally reached the staircase, and I felt a tugging dread as I looked up. The cries were louder now, raw, as though whoever, or whatever, was making them was right above us. My friends urged me on, whispering nervously, but my feet felt like lead as I stepped onto the stairs, one creaky step at a time. My hands grew clammy, my heart a rapid, hollow drumbeat in my chest. At the top, the hallway stretched out in dim light, ending in the room with that high, dreadful window. As we got closer, the air grew colder, sharp enough to sting our skin. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and we hesitated, none of us daring to go first. But the crying grew louder, the broken voice beckoning, pulling us closer. Finally, I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Just that window, a dusty wooden chair beneath it, and a thin layer of dust covering the floor. But the air felt charged, thick with something I couldn't see. I swallowed hard, my eyes fixed on the window. The cries had stopped, leaving an unnerving silence that rang in my ears. And then I saw her. At first, it was only a faint outline reflected in the glass. But as I stared, her form sharpened, a woman, hunched and gaunt, her hollow eyes staring back at me with a look that twisted my stomach. Her face was slack, mouth slightly open, as though she'd been caught mid-scream. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to look away. But I couldn't. Then her face twisted. The mouth stretched wider. The eyes darkened with a depth of suffering that seemed endless. And then, in an instant, she was gone, leaving only the empty glass, my pale reflection staring back at me. We all stumbled back, but as we turned to leave, a fresh wail erupted, louder and more anguished than before. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, rattling the walls and filling the room with a bone-chilling sorrow. I turned back to the window and felt my blood freeze. There, in my reflection, she stood behind me, her mouth stretching wider, her eyes locked onto mine, her fingers reaching toward my shoulder. I backed away, heart pounding, her image fading as I stumbled out of the room. We bolted down the stairs, through the house, and out into the cold night air. None of us said a word, but as I looked back at the house, that wail echoed faintly once more, and there, in the high window, a shadow stared back, mouth open in a silent scream, as if begging us to return. To this day, I still hear her faintly whenever I walk past a window at night. It was a last-minute decision to attend the Halloween masquerade. I'd almost stayed home, but there was something strangely compelling about the invitation, almost as if it had been waiting for me all along. I found a costume tucked away in an old shop downtown, a Victorian plague doctor's outfit, complete with a long coat and beaked mask. The shopkeeper seemed a bit too eager to sell it, almost relieved to see it go, but I chalked it up to Halloween enthusiasm. The masquerade was held at an old estate, the ballroom dimly lit and decorated in elaborate Gothic fashion. People drifted across the floor, their faces hidden behind masks, laughter mingling with the eerie notes of a string quartet. I felt a sense of unease settling over me, but I tried to ignore it, moving through the crowd in search of a familiar face. That's when I saw her. She wore a gown of dark lace, intricate and flowing, a mask covering her face save for a sliver of pale skin around her eyes. She was watching me from across the room, head tilted slightly, as if sizing me up. Something in her gaze felt uncomfortably familiar, though I couldn't place it. With a nod, she beckoned me closer, her eyes never leaving mine. I approached her, my steps slow, careful, as if something fragile were holding me back. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of dread grew, a tension tightening my muscles, making it hard to breathe. She reached out, her hand cold, and slid a piece of paper into my palm before fading back into the crowd without a word. I looked down to find a riddle scrawled in fine, neat handwriting. What wears your face and walks behind you, yet was never truly there. A chill swept over me as I read it, and instinctively, I glanced over my shoulder. The room was packed, people dancing and mingling, but I felt watched, like a pair of eyes lingered on me from just beyond sight. I slipped the paper into my pocket, determined to shrug off the encounter. It was just a strange Halloween game, I told myself. Nothing more. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I moved through the ballroom, scanning the faces around me, but no one looked familiar. Every mask seemed a little too close to mine, every costume a little too similar. I felt an urge to leave, to rip off the mask and escape the suffocating crowd, but I couldn't move, rooted to the spot by a growing sense of dread. I found a quiet corner and tried to collect myself, willing my heartbeat to slow. That's when I noticed the photos. Dozens of them pinned to the wall, each one showing a different figure in a plague doctor's mask. Some of the photos were worn, yellowed, while others looked newly printed. I scanned the faces, and my stomach dropped as I recognized the last one. Me, staring blankly into the camera, my face half hidden by the mask. My heart began to pound. I tore the photo from the wall, but no one seemed to notice or care. The faces around me had all turned away, masks tilted slightly, their backs to me as if I weren't even there. I stumbled back into the ballroom, desperate for fresh air, for a glimpse of someone without that damned mask. But the room had changed. The dim light now cast twisted shadows, and every single person wore the same plague doctor costume, the same dark beak turned toward me. I backed away, feeling as though the walls were closing in. A hand rested on my shoulder, cold and heavy. I turned, heart racing, to find the woman in lace, her mask hovering inches from mine, her eyes empty, hollow. I tried to pull away, but she held firm, whispering something that sent a chill through my bones. Now it's your turn. With a sickening sense of horror, I looked down to find my hands empty. The mask was gone, the costume stripped away. I looked around the room, catching glimpses of myself reflected in every mask, every hollow stare. My face stared back from every angle, every costume a distorted version of my own, the hollow beaks and empty eyes blending until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. In the final moments before darkness closed in, I understood the riddle. I was no longer part of the world I knew. I was just another mask in a sea of empty faces, a memory trapped in the crowd, watching forever from behind the beak of a stranger. It was a Halloween tradition to drive out to the old drive-in on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years, but infamous as a haunt for the daring. The screen stood cracked and looming against the night sky, flickering remnants of long-gone films somehow still clinging to its surface, or so the stories went. This year, it was me, Kyle, and Nick, all piled into Kyle's rusted-out Jeep, braving the dark just for a chance to say we'd been there. As we pulled in, the gravel crunched loud under the tires, the sound swallowed quickly by the heavy, still air. The fog settled in thick patches across the empty lot, turning every shape and shadow into something unsettling. And then, up ahead, we saw it, a single car, parked dead center in front of the screen. Kyle slowed to a crawl as we approached, each of us squinting through the windshield. The car was an ancient model, old enough that even the rust had started to peel, leaving only a faded coat of paint. Its headlights blinked to life as we got closer, bathing the Jeep in a cold, eerie glow. Should we? I started, but the words died on my tongue. Before I could finish, the headlights flickered off, and we sat there, staring into the fog and the darkness, unsure whether to turn back. But Kyle shrugged, acting braver than he looked, and we edged forward, pulling up next to the old car. In the silence, something crackled, a faint sound like static. Then, a flicker of movement on the giant screen caught our attention. The screen glowed to life, showing an old black and white horror film. Grainy images flickered across the screen, silent but eerily clear. A figure moved through the shadows of the film, its face obscured, its movements jerky and wrong. And though I knew it was impossible, the figure's head seemed to turn, as if looking right at us. A cold sweat broke over me. I glanced at Kyle and Nick, but they were fixated on the screen, almost as if they couldn't look away. My heart thumped hard in my chest as I stared, transfixed, feeling something creeping up the back of my mind, a whisper of fear that I couldn't shake. Then, without warning, our own headlights blinked on. Nick let out a sharp gasp, and we all looked around, searching for the culprit. But we were alone, the fog thick and unmoving around us. The Jeep's lights flickered, dimming and brightening, almost as if someone or something was trying to get our attention. What the hell is going on? I muttered, my voice low, hoping the others wouldn't notice the tremor in it. Kyle reached to turn the lights off, but they stayed stubbornly on, casting harsh shadows that stretched far into the fog. The shadows wavered, moving in ways that defied the laws of light. Then came the sound of faint, dragging noise from somewhere behind us. We all whipped around, eyes straining, but the fog was so thick it was like looking into a blank, endless wall. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, echoing across the empty drive-in until it was all I could hear. And then, from somewhere deep in the fog, we saw movement, a figure, making its way toward us in slow, deliberate steps. It looked like me. I blinked, sure my mind was playing tricks, but the figure kept coming closer and closer, its face a twisted, distorted version of my own. My breath hitched, and I looked to Kyle and Nick, only to find two more figures emerging from the mist, each a mirror of them, each wearing an expression of blank, haunting stillness. No, 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 Nick muttered, gripping the seat, his knuckles white. The Jeep's doors locked with a chilling click, trapping us inside. The headlights dimmed until they cast just enough light to illuminate the twisted versions of ourselves standing inches from the windows, staring in, their hands pressed against the glass. They didn't blink, didn't breathe. It was as if they were studying us, waiting. Then, on the screen above us, the silent film changed. Now, it showed us in the Jeep, locked inside, fear plastered across our faces as we stared at our own reflections outside the car. Each of us frozen in terror, a live recording of our horror projected onto the cracked screen for an audience of shadows. I reached for the handle, trying to wrench the door open, but it wouldn't budge. My twisted mirror self grinned, a slow, malicious smile, its head tilting in mock sympathy. The dragging noise grew louder, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. With a sudden flicker, the screen went black, and the figures outside the Jeep faded into the fog, vanishing as if they'd never been there. The headlights went out, plunging us into absolute darkness. We sat in silence, breath shaky, until Kyle managed to start the Jeep. As we sped out of the lot, I dared one last glance in the mirror, and there, standing in the fog, were three figures, each with faces just like ours, watching as we left. I've never been back, but on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that dragging sound, moving just a little closer every time. We almost didn't go to the pumpkin patch that year. Life was busy, and we were running out of time to prepare for Halloween, but the kids insisted, and it was our family tradition. The patch was located on an old farm, tucked between dense trees that cast long shadows over the field as the sun dipped low. The air was thick with that peculiar autumn chill, the one that clings to you and makes every whisper of wind sound like footsteps. The pumpkins were beautiful, vibrant oranges and deep yellows, spread out in neat rows, each one perfect in its own way. But as we wandered through, my husband Jack stopped dead in his tracks, a strange expression on his face. He pointed to one of the pumpkins, and when I looked closer, my stomach twisted. Carved into its side were initials and a date. Mine along with a date from years ago, a date of no significance. But it wasn't the only one. As we walked deeper into the patch, we found more, each one marked with a name, initials, and a different date, each hauntingly specific. One pumpkin had Jack's initials. Another bore our daughter's name. Even our son's initials appeared on a particularly large pumpkin at the far end. It felt like a prank, something stupid someone had set up to scare people, but it was too eerie, too detailed. The letters were carved with precision, each cut deep, no mistake or hesitation in the knife marks. I laughed nervously, saying we should just grab a pumpkin and go, but I could tell Jack was disturbed. He muttered something about it just being a coincidence, but his hand tightened on mine as we headed back to the front. That night, as we carved our pumpkins on the front porch, the air was thick, expectant, and the feeling of being watched lingered. I shook it off, forcing myself to focus on the kids' laughter, but the pumpkins sat there, watching us with hollow eyes. Each one seemed to lean forward, as if listening, as we cut away their features, scooping out seeds and flesh. When we were done, we left them on the porch, candles flickering inside. I went to bed with a heavy unease settling in my stomach. In the darkness, I kept picturing the field of pumpkins, each one with a date, an initial. I told myself it was just a joke, just a harmless prank, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. In the morning, we woke to a smell that hit me the second I opened the door, a sour, earthy scent, almost like decay. My heart sank as I stepped outside, seeing the pumpkins we'd carved the night before. They were rotting, their skins shriveled and mottled with dark spots, seeds and pulp spilling from their mouths like something living had burst from them. It didn't make sense. We'd only carved them hours ago. Jack inspected them, muttering that it must be some sort of disease, but his face was pale. He didn't have any answers either. The children were upset, and we promised we'd get new ones that day. But when we returned that evening, our yard was full of pumpkins, each one fresh, uncarved, and somehow perfectly placed, as though someone had arranged them with meticulous care. Each pumpkin bore our initials. The dates were new, recent this time. They were Halloween dates just a day away. A cold fear gripped me. It felt like a threat, a reminder. Jack went out, kicking one of the pumpkins over, but another appeared in its place by morning, as fresh and lifelike as before, with the same initials, the same date carved into it. By Halloween night, the air around our home felt heavy, stifling, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The pumpkins sat in silent vigil around our yard, a circle of orange, each face grim and unmoving, each marking our family's initials and a date that seemed to taunt us. The kids wouldn't go near them, and I didn't blame them. There was a smell to those pumpkins, a faint odor that clung to our clothes and lingered in our rooms, like wet earth after a storm. That night, I sat up late, watching the pumpkins from the window, waiting, hoping they'd just disappear. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint scratching at the front door. I froze, my heart racing, too afraid to move. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging slowly down wood. I turned toward the window and saw the pumpkins, each one facing the house now, their hollow, carved mouths twisted into warped smiles, their eyes glowing in the dark without any candles inside them. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for the scratching to stop, but when it finally did, there was only silence and the pumpkins, now smashed and decaying across our lawn as though they'd never been whole. By morning, they were gone, and we never spoke about the pumpkins again. But every Halloween since, I wake to find just one waiting on the porch, fresh and untouched, my initials and a date carved deep into its skin. I had always loved Halloween, the thrill of costumes, the flickering jack-o'-lanterns, the eerie way shadows stretched longer as the night wore on. This year, I planned to go as a vintage actress, all dark curls and bold lipstick, and I'd spent the better part of the evening trying to get my makeup just right. But tonight, something felt off. The house was quiet, the usual comforting hum of noises strangely absent. The silence seemed to press down on me as I sat in front of my vanity, the glow from my makeup mirror casting my face in sharp relief. A faint, inexplicable chill swept over me as I began to apply mascara, leaning in close, my reflection staring back, dark eyes wide and still. I tried to focus, but there was an uncomfortable feeling gnawing at me, as if something was watching, just out of sight. I brushed it off, blaming it on nerves, on the late hour, but when I looked back at the mirror, I froze. For just a second, my reflection didn't match my movements. I blinked, and so did she, but slower, lagging, as if struggling to catch up. My heart hammered. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the mirror. This time, when I looked away, I saw it. My reflection moved on its own, turning to stare back at me, her head tilting slightly, lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. My stomach twisted, a cold panic settling deep inside me. I reached up to touch my face, as if that would break the spell, but she just stared, her eyes dark and unblinking. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was tired imagining things. But when I glanced back, I saw that my reflection was wearing something different. I hadn't chosen that dress, hadn't done my hair that way. The woman staring back at me was me, but dressed in a strange, old-fashioned gown, her hair pinned back in a style I hadn't even considered. I pulled away from the mirror, breathing shallow and quick, but my reflection didn't follow. She just stayed there, watching, her expression unreadable, as if waiting. I felt an irrational urge to reach out, to touch the glass, to see if she was real. Slowly, almost without thinking, I leaned forward, my fingers trembling as I pressed them to the cool surface. For a moment, nothing happened, but then, with a horrifying clarity, I felt something press back. A shock ran through me. My reflection's eyes widened, her mouth parting in a silent scream as her fingers seemed to press into mine from the other side. I jerked my hand back, but the cold sensation lingered, a tingling in my fingertips as if they'd touched something not entirely there. The room felt tighter, smaller. I backed away from the mirror, heart pounding, but every inch of me felt drawn back to it, a horrible compulsion to look again, to see what she would do next. I resisted, but I couldn't ignore the feeling, the sense that if I turned away, something would happen. She would be free. I glanced again, and there she was, her hand raised, waving slowly, taunting me. Her mouth moved now, lips forming words I couldn't hear, mouthing syllables that sent a shiver down my spine. I stared, trying to make out what she was saying, each silent word dragging me deeper into the cold horror spreading through my body. I was too afraid to blink, to look away, but I couldn't hold her gaze. I turned, but as I did, a faint whisper filled the air, a sound like distant static, growing louder. I felt a tug at my sleeve and looked back, my stomach dropping as I saw her hand reaching through the glass, her fingers brushing against the surface from the other side, clawing desperately. And then she spoke. "I'm waiting," she mouthed, her voice a whisper in my head, faint and cold. "Let me in." I stumbled back, my pulse racing, and turned to leave the room, but her voice echoed, growing louder, closer. I fled down the hallway, but the mirrors I passed showed her face, her pale, hollow eyes watching me, her mouth curling into a dark smile with every step I took. As I slammed my bedroom door shut, the whisper stopped. My heart pounded, and I braced myself, gripping the door, half expecting her to come through, to reach for me from the other side. But there was only silence. In the morning, I avoided the mirrors. I couldn't bring myself to look, to see if she was still there. But every time I caught a glimpse of my reflection, I saw it, just for a second, a faint figure, lingering in the background, her dark eyes fixed on mine, waiting for the moment I would look long enough to let her through. When we bought the house, people warned us. It was famous in a small-town way for the things that happened there on Halloween. But it was such a good deal, a sprawling vintage beauty that we couldn't resist, especially after hearing the old stories from the real estate agent, who laughed them off as harmless folklore. The house was gorgeous during the day, flooded with warm light from its huge windows, but at night, especially as Halloween approached, it took on a different feel. It became cold, almost unwelcoming, shadows lurking in the corners, the wood creaking and groaning as though adjusting to some invisible weight. On our first night, we heard the floorboards. It was faint at first, just a quiet, intermittent creak that sounded like it came from somewhere down the hall. We brushed it off as the house settling, too tired from unpacking to care. But as the nights wore on, the creaks became louder, more defined, following a path from the basement up through the house, step by heavy step, always around midnight. An unease grew in my stomach, but I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just old wood, drafty rooms. But then the sound started to shift, becoming less random, more rhythmic, like footsteps pacing through the house in the dead of night. It felt deliberate, like someone was walking around, getting closer each night. I started counting the steps, 12 creaks from the basement, up the stairs, another 10 down the hallway. Every night, they'd stop right outside our bedroom door. I tried not to think about it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then one night, the steps didn't stop. The floor creaked just outside the door, and I held my breath, staring at the dark line beneath the door, half expecting to see shadows moving just beyond it. The silence was suffocating, thick, and I could feel something on the other side, standing there, waiting. I tried to wake my husband, but he just mumbled and rolled over, oblivious. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate scratch at the door, like fingernails dragging along the wood. I froze, heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out as I listened to the sound, my pulse echoing in my ears. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped abruptly, leaving the silence even heavier, pressing down on me. I couldn't sleep after that. The next day, I told my husband, and he laughed it off, saying I was probably just tired. But he stopped laughing when he found the scratches on the door, thin, jagged lines gouged into the wood just beneath the handle. We tried to rationalize it, but there was no explanation that made sense. Halloween night came, and by then, the creaks had become an unavoidable nightly routine, always the same. Midnight came, and with it, the footsteps. This time, they were slower, more deliberate, each creak sharper, echoing through the house like a countdown. My husband and I lay in bed, staring at the door, holding hands, both too afraid to speak. Then, the footsteps didn't stop at the door. We heard them move through the room, circling our bed, the floorboards creaking beneath an unseen weight, slow and heavy. My husband gripped my hand tighter, but I couldn't even breathe, paralyzed as the sound circled us. Each step deliberate, taunting. Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence fell, thick and unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was staring at us, just waiting for one of us to move. We lay there, stiff with fear, until finally, in a whisper, my husband said, "Maybe it's gone." But as he spoke, the floorboards creaked once more, right by the foot of our bed. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out, my hand shaking, and turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. But there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure. Just the cold, empty air and the faint impression of footprints in the dust by the door. I barely slept that night. When dawn finally broke, I decided I couldn't stay in the house another night. We packed up, leaving most of our things, desperate to get away from whatever haunted that place. But as we left, I glanced back one last time and saw it. A figure standing in the upstairs window, watching us, its face a blur, features indistinct, but the gaze unmistakable. Every year, as Halloween approaches, I still hear it, the faint, relentless creak of those footsteps, always coming closer, always stopping just outside our door. The night shift at the cemetery was usually easy, boring even. Just the faint hum of security cameras, the occasional buzz of the radio, and the quiet stretch of gravestones fading into the shadows. Halloween, though, always had a different feel to it. The air was thick, cold, and silent, like the whole place was holding its breath. I settled into the office around midnight, the only light coming from the monitor screens, each one cycling through grainy black and white images of the grounds. Row after row of tombstones, statues, and empty pathways stared back at me, unmoving. But tonight, as I glanced at the screens, I couldn't shake a feeling, a prickling, crawling sensation that raised every hair on my neck. About an hour into my shift, I saw it. Just a flicker, really, on one of the screens. A dark shape moving behind a row of graves. I squinted, telling myself it was a trick of the cameras, maybe a shadow from the trees, but there was something too distinct about it, too human-shaped. I changed the angle, trying to get a better view, but whatever it was had vanished, leaving the screen empty. I leaned back, exhaling, telling myself it was nothing, but my eyes kept drifting back to that spot. Then, the radio crackled, a faint, muffled sound like whispering. A chill slid down my spine. I reached for it, clearing my throat before speaking. "Is anyone on the grounds?" The radio hissed, silent for a second. Then more whispers, soft and faint. Just below hearing, like someone speaking right into my ear, only too quietly to make out the words. I turned the volume down, trying to ignore the static, but the whispering continued, barely audible, yet somehow insistent, digging into the quiet of the room. I forced myself to keep watching the screens, cycling through the usual empty views until I saw it again. This time, a figure stood in the center of one of the paths, unmoving, its face turned toward the camera. I squinted, leaning forward, feeling my pulse quicken. The figure was too far to see clearly, but it was there, a shadow, standing amid the tombstones, just staring. I pressed the button to switch cameras, but every angle showed the same thing, an empty path. I switched back, expecting to see the shadow still there, but the path was deserted again. My heart hammered in my chest. I sat back, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, an artifact of the camera, anything to make sense of what I'd seen. Then, the radio crackled again. This time, it was louder, the whispers clearer, like they were right there in the room with me. I strained to hear, catching snippets of broken words, just barely, "behind you." I spun around, every nerve on edge, but the room was empty. Only the faint hum of the screens filled the silence. But I could swear I still felt someone there, standing just beyond my line of sight. A dread settled over me, cold and suffocating. I turned back to the screens, my fingers trembling, trying to keep my breathing steady. On one of the screens, I saw the figure again. Closer this time, its face was turned away, but it was coming down the path step by slow step, moving closer to the office. I cycled through the other views, hoping it was just another illusion, but the figure appeared on each one, inching closer until it was on the steps outside. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The figure had stopped at the door, shadowed and silent, the dark of its face just barely visible under the weak outdoor light. I held my breath, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to get up, to leave, but I was frozen in place, waiting, staring. Then, on the screen, I saw the door handle turn. I whipped around, eyes wide, watching as the handle jerked and twisted, rattling like someone was forcing it open. My hand went to the radio, but my fingers were numb, trembling, the whispers growing louder, insistent, filling my head until it was all I could hear. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening, ringing in my ears as the handle fell still. I stayed there, breath shallow, staring at the door, but nothing happened. The monitors had all gone blank, leaving only my reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. I reached for the door, hands shaking, and pulled it open. The grounds were empty, the paths silent, stretching out into the dark. There was no sign of anyone, no footsteps, no shadows. Just rows of silent graves, waiting under the cold Halloween moon. But as I turned back toward the office, I caught sight of something on the last monitor, something small and dark, written on the screen in jagged letters. Just 2 words, "Look behind." I didn't turn. I shut the door, locked it, and stayed there, watching the monitor, knowing deep down that whatever was out there would wait for me, forever, just a step behind. Halloween night was always a blur of kids in costumes, laughter, and the soft glow of flashlights bobbing down the streets. Our small town had its traditions, and one of them was the children's Halloween parade, where the kids would march in costume from one end of town to the other before scattering for trick-or-treating. This year, I stood on my front porch watching them gather, their colorful costumes vivid against the darkening sky. But as the parade began, an uneasy feeling prickled over me. The kids looked different. There was a strange, hollow look to some of their faces, a stiffness to their movements that felt wrong. I told myself it was just the shadows or maybe the masks they wore, but something inside me knew better. As they passed my house, a group of them slowed, their eyes locking onto me. A shiver ran down my spine. Their costumes were simple, witches, ghosts, a few skeletons, but their faces were blank. each one wearing an identical, unnervingly calm expression. One child wore a pumpkin mask with hollow eyes, but even through that, I felt his stare bore into me. I watched them continue down the street, but a few of them lingered just a second too long, looking over their shoulders before turning back to join the others. I stepped back inside, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. But as I closed the door, I couldn't resist one last glance. To my horror, I saw my own son walking in the parade. He'd gone out earlier, but he was supposed to be with friends trick-or-treating. Confused, I watched him, his costume unmistakable, his stride oddly mechanical, head straight forward, never glancing around like he usually did. I called out his name, my voice thin and shaky, but he didn't turn. None of them did. I ran to the end of my driveway, calling out to him again, louder this time. A few heads turned, faces hidden behind masks, eyes dark and cold. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I kept calling. And then, as if in response, they all stopped. They stood in the middle of the street, silent, their faces tilted toward me. My son stood among them, his expression blank, mouth slightly open, but his eyes were empty. I took a step closer, panic rising as I called his name again. But he didn't move. None of them did. They just stared, an army of children, each one motionless, each face twisted into a vague, distant expression that seemed to mock me. One of the kids in the front, a small girl in a doll mask, raised her hand and waved, a slow, eerie gesture that sent a cold fear through me. Her hand dropped, and she started walking again, leading the others in silent lockstep down the street, my son among them. I tried to follow, but they quickened their pace, almost gliding down the road, the sounds of their footsteps blending into a single rhythmic pulse. I called my husband, frantic, and he insisted our son had just left with his friends, that it was impossible for him to be in the parade. He told me to calm down, to wait, that they'd be back soon. But I couldn't let go of the sight of those eyes, of that frozen expression. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my coat and set off in the direction of the parade, my heart pounding with every step. As I walked, the streets grew emptier, quieter. Houses lined the road, but the usual Halloween decorations and lights felt dim, muted, as though the whole town were asleep. I finally reached the end of the parade route, expecting to see the kids spilling out into the streets, laughing and darting toward houses. But it was empty, the last stretch of road deserted and dark. No sign of them, no sound. I turned, searching the shadows, when I spotted them, just for a second, a line of small figures at the edge of the woods, standing still, watching. The girl in the doll mask waved again, the movement slow, deliberate. I took a step toward them, heart racing, but they turned as one, disappearing into the trees with an eerie, fluid grace that sent chills down my spine. I ran after them, but the woods swallowed me in darkness, the ground uneven, branches snagging in my clothes as I stumbled through. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows, and I called out my son's name, desperate, but only silence answered me. When I returned home, my son was waiting for me on the porch, his expression dazed, his costume wrinkled and dirty. He didn't remember the parade, didn't remember anything strange, just stared at me blankly as I hugged him, relief washing over me. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes catch him staring out the window, his eyes distant, almost vacant, as though he's listening for something only he can hear. And sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft tapping on the window, like small fingers brushing against the glass, beckoning him back to the parade. The local corn maze was known for its twists and turns, winding paths cut deep into walls of towering corn, and rumors that you could hear footsteps when no one else was around. But those were just stories, the kind everyone laughed off in the light. It was different now, in the thick of night, alone, with nothing but the rustling leaves and the damp, earthy smell of the maze. I'd gotten separated from my friends almost immediately, their voices fading as I took a wrong turn. The path twisted in on itself, one section of corn blending seamlessly into the next. The moon offered little light, leaving the path ahead shadowed and uncertain. A creeping unease settled over me as I turned another corner and found only more walls of corn, stretching in every direction. And then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustling, almost too soft to notice, coming from somewhere behind me. I brushed it off as the wind, convincing myself there was no reason to be afraid. But the rustling grew louder, closer, transforming into distinct, heavy footsteps, keeping pace with mine. My pulse quickened. I told myself not to panic, to stay calm, that it was just someone else lost in the maze. But when I stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped too, a second's delay, as if whoever or whatever was following me was waiting, listening. I kept walking, faster now, my shoes crunching against the dirt path. I turned corner after corner, hoping to find an exit, but the footsteps never wavered, growing louder, heavier. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, hidden somewhere in the dark, tracking my every move. I stole a glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just endless rows of corn, bending and swaying as though something had brushed through them. Desperation clawed at me as I picked up the pace, my heart pounding as I dashed around another corner. The walls seemed to narrow, pressing in, trapping me in their grasp. And then, in the flicker of moonlight, I saw it. Something was standing at the far end of the path. Its face was my face. I froze, every inch of me locked in place, staring at the figure ahead. It looked like me, but somehow wrong. Its features were twisted, eyes too wide, lips stretched into a cold, empty smile. An icy dread seeped into my bones as it tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then it took a step forward, and I bolted, tearing down the path, heart hammering as I fled from my own face. I glanced back, breath hitching as I saw it following, its movements eerily calm, yet fast, as if it knew every turn, every twist. Each time I looked back, it was closer, its smile wider, the eyes darker, swallowing every trace of light. I lost all sense of direction, the walls of corn blurring as I pushed myself faster, my lungs burning. The maze seemed endless, stretching on, the paths looping back, trapping me in its suffocating grasp. No matter which way I ran, I'd find it there, waiting, face half lit by the sliver of moonlight, that dreadful grin never fading. My legs began to give out, muscles aching, lungs raw from the cold air. But I couldn't stop, couldn't let it catch me. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to pull myself up, veering down yet another path, hoping, praying for an exit. But all I found was more maze, endless, twisting, and that sound, the steady crunch of footsteps behind me, a metronome of dread ticking away my chances of escape. Finally, I rounded a corner and saw what I thought was the entrance, the faint outline of a wooden sign in the distance. Relief surged through me, and I sprinted toward it, desperate to escape. But as I got closer, I saw the sign didn't say entrance or exit. It was blank. And then it was there, directly in front of me, blocking the path, a mirror of myself, the face that shouldn't be mine. Its mouth opened slowly, an empty black hole. No sound coming out but the pure, silent intent of something that wanted to take everything I was. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my breath hitching in terror. It took a step closer, and another, closing the gap between us with slow, deliberate strides, its hollow eyes fixed on me with a hunger that went beyond anything human. I turned and ran, back into the maze, back into the endless, twisting darkness, with my own face following me, grinning, always a step behind, as if waiting for me to collapse, to give up so it could take my place in the world outside the corn. And from then on, each Halloween, I hear footsteps behind me, even when I'm alone, even when I'm far from the maze. Always one step behind, always waiting for me to let my guard down. Don't forget to subscribe and watch more of my videos. Thank you.